Okay, so welcome to another conversation. So today I'm joined again by Amanda Sukenick and Matti Häyry, and I'm welcoming them back because they have written a paper which is called, and I'm sure everyone watching this has already heard about it, but it's called Imposing a Lifestyle, a New Argument for Antinatalism. So I've already heard, I don't know if there's been any updates since then, but I believe I saw Matti share somewhere that it was within a certain amount of time of being published, it was the most read um, uh, publication in the Cambridge Quarterly of, is it Healthcare Ethics? Yeah, I'm getting that right.
August ratings were that usually there are about, well, at the most 1,000 views per month, and ours got 3,500. So we were just
yeah.
through the roof.
Okay, cool. So we are obviously in the presence of celebrities now.
Yes, absolutely.
So my first question, let's just dive right into the paper. So my first question is just like, where did it come from? What was the inspiration for the paper?
Amanda, what happened?
So, when Matti and I did episode number 65 of the Exploring Antinatalism podcast, there were a number of questions that I asked Matti during that episode about like what his feelings were about, like what the strongest arguments about antinatalism were, like whether he thought risk was the strongest, or consent, or asymmetry, and just his general feelings on that. And the way that he so expertly answered those questions really got me thinking about the standard philanthropic antinatalist arguments in a way that I really hadn't before, and about how they're used. And for me, the missing piece of imposition, which is an argument that I had been very heavily acquainted with for many years, and we'll get into a little bit about that history, I'm sure, in a bit. That missing piece and what that missing piece meant became a louder focus for me than it ever had been. And I remember in the comments of that video, I said something like, where is the imposition in all of this? Like, I've always believed it to be the strongest argument. It's kind of the argument I've always been the most familiar with. It seems to have no academic history, which was totally wrong, by the way, but that's what I believed at the time. That was my familiarity with it. And I think from there, Matti and I just started talking about like what is imposition, where does it fall, what role does it play that maybe isn't being adequately played with by the other arguments. Like, what is it doing that the other arguments aren't doing, and also what does it mean in terms of antinatalist activism? Because I think when the original philanthropic arguments for antinatalism were created, there kind of was no antinatalist activism. I mean, it kind of existed in the forms of Vehement and the Church of Euthanasia, but those groups were like really separate at that time. I mean, the worlds of the growing, whatever was growing and bubbling up to the surface and becoming antinatalism was pretty separate from those groups and those particular arguments. So it just seemed like there was this missing piece in imposition that had all of this potential, and it kind of started to obsess us in the best way possible. And so the paper kind of grew out of that.
Yeah. And go on, Matti.
And this is exactly why I should always let Amanda go first, because then I learn the history of these things, and I see now her cunning plan. 15 months ago, she first contacts me, does an Exploring Antinatalism podcast, then slowly but surely leads me into this abyss of antinatalism, and lets me write all these articles about this argument and that argument and this argument, and all the time preparing me for this argument from imposition. Look at her.
All going according to my plan. The four-dimensional math that everyone thinks I'm capable of is real. Yes.
Yeah. So before we get on to the actual argument, in the article you laid out sort of a critique, I guess, of the popular arguments for antinatalism, like the axiological asymmetry, consent, risk, all of the sort of, the goods and the greats of antinatalism. What is the critique that you laid out? What is the critique you have of these arguments? And does the new argument serve to replace them or just complement them in terms of advocacy?
May I, Amanda, go first this time so you can correct me?
Go for it.
Okay.
I have no correction, I'm sure.
Okay. So I think that the main critique that comes out of the paper is simply that they are too complicated for anyone in the street to understand, or they are too easy to resist. I mean, starting with the poor quality of life argument. Every life is bad. We shouldn't create bad lives. Therefore, we shouldn't create lives at all. Except that the response is that my life is good and John's life is good and Jill's life is good and the lives of our children are also good. So you are simply wrong. So go away. Don't bother me anymore. At this point, we try to come back with the axiological asymmetry argument, and we say, yeah, well, but we have established now that if the life would be bad, then we shouldn't be creating it. Now, about good lives, we have this axiological asymmetry theory, which is saying that creating good is not such an urgent thing than avoiding bad is. So we don't have any obligation, any duty to bring about good lives. And then there are about half a dozen, of course, counter-arguments to that. But now Jill and John's friend says, okay, let's grant that for the argument's sake, but you only have now established that it's not my duty to have children, but I may still be permitted to have children. I may have a leave, a license, whatever. There's no duty against me having children, according to your argument from axiological asymmetry. If I'm understanding this incorrectly, then correct me. But this is how I see Jill and John's friend saying to us. At this point, if we really think that Jill and John's friend understands philosophy and jurisprudence, we go to the consent argument, because the way that was construed in the beginning originally was just to answer this question. It's to say that there are things that we can do to other people and for other people without their permission, without their consent. But these are limited. These are limited to where severe harm could befall them if we don't interfere. So if you are stepping in front of a car and the car will crash into you and you will be horribly hurt, then if I don't have time to call out and warn you, then I am allowed to kick you out of the way, even if you get hurt in there. And my justification is that I'm preventing severe harm to you, and I may do that. But I'm not allowed to do things that I think are good for you. I'm not allowed to sign you on French classes, which are obligatory from there on, so that you can learn French and be a better person. It's not in my remit to do that to you. That's paternalism, and that's bad. Now, if Jill and John's friend and Jill and Jones are still with us, and I doubt it, then we might still go to risk or whatever argument here. But now a pattern is forming. We are always talking about something that doesn't exist. Something that doesn't exist consents or doesn't consent. Something that doesn't exist will have a good life or a bad life. Something may have a good life or bad life, but it doesn't exist. So what our thing here is, Amanda, correct me if I'm wrong, or accompany me if I'm right. This was our revelation that we should be talking about people who already exist.
Yeah, that's 100% right.
Cool. So the the critique that you have of sort of established arguments is not necessarily that the arguments don't hold in and of themselves. It's just that when you apply them to conversation and advocacy, they tend to be quite hard to grasp for the average person, and so they're not as useful at all. Is that basically that's sort of the substance of the critique?
If I may, it's not that they're not useful at all. I mean, there are people that are absolutely convinced of to not have children by the consent argument or by risk or by asymmetry, and that goes for both hardcore antinatalists and like a lay population. You know, sometimes those arguments do work a kind of magic, and so none of them can be abandoned. They're all extremely important tools in the antinatalist tool chest. I mean, we really cannot do away with any of them. But as Matti said, the problem of only talking about beings that don't exist is way too huge a hurdle for most people to get past. And that's one of the reasons why I've always believed that the imposition argument in its simplest form has a great deal of strength that the others don't. Because if we're saying that something is being imposed, it doesn't just mean at birth. It means while you're alive. It can apply to all experiences in a lived life. You know, as we say in the article at some point, it's not just birth. It's the months and the years and the minutes and the seconds of a lived experience. That's what imposition is. And the quality of life argument does that to some extent. You know, it is about not just birth, but also living. But it doesn't also have this added element of this is something that was done to you. This is one will completely superseding the desires of another. You know, in this case, a completely innocent, unsuspecting child. You know, that has to go live a life. So there's huge, and again, you know, they're just none of these arguments were made for the purpose of anti-natalist activism and for regular people. I mean, you know, these arguments have huge. You know, not everyone's a philosopher. Some people come from a completely different basis and need an argument that isn't a Rubik's cube. I mean, my critique of the asymmetry has always been that this is an extremely important piece of logic. There's nothing in me that would in any way desire to get rid of it, but it's just not useful to regular people. And let's be honest here, like most antinatalists, myself included, don't argue asymmetry particularly well. I mean, I've heard horror stories of people being out on the street and they get out the little squares, you know, and like talk of, you know, try to use the visuals of the asymmetry argument, and like it's just too much. I mean, to just communicate, don't have kids. We shouldn't be using all of this complex math essentially. So simpler tools are needed.
Just one addition to that one. Now, I'm not dissing the arguments. I have myself for Amanda for how long? Is it 30 or 40 years? I have.
Yeah.
Which one is it?
40, almost 40. My entire lifetime.
And I have tried to hone the risk argument, and well, in exactly that form, in its now classical form, 20 years. But I'm always changing it, and perhaps the imposition argument is a variation of that. It's just that people seem to be more convinced about that than anything else in the defenses of antinatalism, that you may be creating a horrible life, or the life you create may be bad. And that sort of stops people for a while. But then they say, but then again, I and Jill and Joan, we go to a good doctor and they'll take care that the baby will be all right. And we are good middle class family people anyway, so our child's life will be great. So they are squirming themselves out of this. And I've been trying to find an angle to get in, but perhaps at some point, Amanda and I will get there. In the meantime, you will have to do with the argument from imposition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, sorry, were you going to add something, Amanda?
No, I just want to say that, I mean, and I'm not just saying this because the creator of the risk argument happens to be in the room, but yeah, risk, I think, is the strongest of the older philanthropic arguments, because a great deal of people are risk averse. I mean, that is something that does speak to people on a very basic level. And so I still think out of all of them, that is, as I've said before, and I mean no insult to it, it is an argument so easy that even a child can understand risk. They might not understand the consent argument, they might understand the imposition argument, but risk is something that just about anybody can understand. But right, as Matti said, it just doesn't tend to be enough to get people all the way there towards antinatalism.
So, yeah. So, what actually is the argument then? How would you explain it to a layperson on the street?
The argument from imposition?
Yeah. The post-natal imposition argument. Yeah.
Right. So imposition in its most basic form. I mean, before Matti and I had our go with it, is simply that it's you're imposing your will onto another being, and that by its very nature is wrong. But it doesn't. The older versions of the imposition argument don't really specify what exactly you're imposing. And so our version, again, it comes from this postnatal perspective. You're imposing this need for meaning, this circumstance where there's no easy way out, there's no easy access to euthanasia, and there's also this imposition to be a procreator. I mean, that's a huge part of what is imposed on every new being that is created, is that they're going to continue these bloodlines, they're going to continue the dictates of the DNA. And so it's been formulated in a lot of different ways over time. I mean, Julio Cabrera talks about manipulation. These are other good words to use to describe sort of what we mean by the imposition argument. But essentially, it's a way of trying to get people to understand that when they create a life, they're setting these years in motion, and that there's all of these sort of inescapable things to do with identity and purpose and direction that the person is trapped by, has no choice to, has no autonomy to go and do something else without our lovely argument kind of getting them out of Dodge a little bit. So
right. So if I understand it, it's that basically once someone exists, there's going to be a whole plethora of demands on them, basically. And these are from a range of different angles, right? There will be socio-political demands of, certain, moral codes that you have to live by and etiquette that you have to live by, but also biological demands. So you've got to feed yourself, you have to maintain basic hygiene. Although I think quite a few people try to rebel against that one. You need to maintain a basic level of fitness, and you, as you said, we all, our human existence kind of demands that we have some sense of meaning, as you said. So there's like a range of demands that are inherent in existence, but also the specific context that we're each in. So we each live in different countries and cultures. Those will have, a variety of different demands on the average person, whether there be religious demands or other types of demands. So does the idea of imposition really center or found itself on demands, or am I sort of misplacing it somewhat?
Yes, well, we all have lifestyles, and they have been, well, we have learned them from somewhere. And sort of our novelty or our point here is that it happens, this imposition, this learning of this lifestyle, having children, it comes on us so early that we cannot resist it. We are getting it
Right.
as children, and it's almost impossible to get away from it. I mean, of course, things are told us, and we are told things to do when we are children, learning French and taking piano lessons and what else. But those are all things that we can walk away from later on. We can never use a word of French later, or do the dee da dee da dee da dee da 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 and whatever. We can walk away from that, but we cannot walk away from the wider lifestyle, which may take on some religious, say Christian or whatever forms as well, but which has as its core the reproduction. So that's the one given. You shall reproduce. You shall also honor thy parents and all that, but that's a side issue almost in there. But so anyway, our point is, it happens when they are vulnerable, when we are vulnerable, and it's almost impossible to get rid of it. We can get rid of it. I'm telling myself that I have gotten away from it, and the imposition was only attempted. But now, to use the criminal law term, the attempt is punishable as well.
Okay.
It's an expectation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I get what you mean. So in the article, you highlight 3 criteria that you believe sort of form a solid foundation for an impositions-based argument for antinatalism. And I'll just read them out so I don't get them wrong. So there's the first one is directed at actual existing beings, brackets, to avoid the metaphysical abyss of involving imaginary possible future individuals. The second one is avoidable, but only with considerable effort, to give hope, brackets, to give hope of emancipation amidst the concrete intrusion. And the third one is objectionable, brackets, to steer clear of the never-ending disputes over the value of life and death to different individuals and groups. So are you able to explain each of these 3 points and why they're important?
The first one is important because it is really abstract for many people. I mean, an antinatalist will understand an argument from a choice before birth, but the pronatalist will not sort of understand it, and it is an abstract argument anyway. It sort of gives our starting point away to the pronatalists in the beginning, that there is already someone in there waiting in line to be born, and that sort of gives them the upper hand from the beginning. So I think that I myself avoided this problem 30 years ago in liberal utilitarianism and applied ethics when I wrote this classic sentence. I was using a need-based theory. There is no need to come existent, and that just tells it all. There is just nothing. There's no one there. So why are we then talking about the good lives and bad lives and permissions and consents and risks of these non-existent imaginary thingies? What are we talking about? We are talking about nothing. So that was the first one. What was the second one?
The second one was
must be avoidable, but only just. So only just because we want it to be really to keep us in firm grips, because otherwise it's not serious. But of course, we have to be able to break out of it as well, because otherwise, what are we preaching here? Determinism, and stay where you are because you are determined to be there. So we cannot do that. And then the third one was
unobjectionable.
Yes, absolutely. So that the bad thing, that people cannot say, well, that's a relativistic matter, and some people think that it's a good thing, some people think that it's a bad thing. We are saying that you are stealing the child, robbing the life, the child of its, what's the name now, future, open future. You are robbing the child of its open future, and the child indubitably should have their open future, the future where they can walk away from their French lessons and piano lessons later. But from this they can't. Well, they can. Now referring back to number 2, yes, we can avoid it, but it's very difficult to avoid it. But it's a bad thing. It's a bad thing to impose that on the child. Amanda, what did I forget?
No, I think you got it all. It's just, it's a bad thing to impose something on a child that they don't end up having a choice about, and imposing the the mandate to be a procreator and to live, those are not, as Matti said, easily walked away from as piano lessons.
So I'm thinking of, so I'm trying to put my self in like the place of, someone who is, I'm not sure if this is the right term, but like a sort of nominal natalist, right? You're just sort of in the sort of, lukewarm waters of society. You kind of absorb the views around you by osmosis. Sort of fit in the cultural mainstream. And I'm trying to think, if they heard what you were saying, what sort of things would come to their mind. Now, I'm going to come out with some very basic stuff, because I think it's going to be very basic stuff that they come up with. But some things that I think the average person may say to what you've just said is something along the lines of, well, yes, it is bad to impose a specific lifestyle on a child. You could even refer to it as like indoctrination, especially when they're born and very vulnerable. But I'm going to be one of these parents that's very, liberal, and I'm not going to, if my child, if I have a boy and they want to wear a dress, I'm completely open to that. I'm very sort of open to how my child would want to live their life, and I will be very what's it called, affirmative, is that the word, or like encouraging, you know what I mean. I'm going to be one of these parents. How do you think, how would you respond to that?
I mean, it's never something any procreator really has control over, right? I mean, you can give a child, it's not a specific lifestyle that's the imposition. It's all lifestyles are the imposition that we're talking about. I mean, to have all of this choice in life and what we wear and that's, what we eat, or whatever this parent is allowing. I mean, that's very nice, and that's a better childhood than some, certainly. But they're still going to be a part of society. They're still going to be a slave, essentially, to all of these pressures that the parent really has no control over whatsoever. And the mandate and the pressures to be a procreator, and the what's the word I'm looking for? Like the punishment of not
like the social cost.
The social cost, yeah, there you go. The social cost of not going along with that, predetermined plan is going to be tremendous on any person, basically, that we create. There's way to there's really no way that the parent has any control over that not happening.
If I may stress the fact that we can continue the conversation with this person. This person is now saying that they will give their child a very liberal and open education, and the child can decide for her or himself. Now, I would continue the conversation by asking, but would you honestly also tell the child about the possibility of not having children? Would you sort of, you will advocate your own style just by being you, but will you also say to the child that it's okay for them not to have children? And then the child says back, but mommy, would it have been okay for you not to have me? Yes, child. In that case, I'm unwanted. Oh, how can you say anything so horrible? Whoa! And I mean, to avoid a situation like that, there are limitations to what even the liberal, educated, whatever person can say to their child, I think.
Yeah, that's an incredibly important point. Yep. That, I mean, once you create somebody, look at Danny Shine. It becomes really, really difficult to start having antinatalist conversations with the people that we create, because they know that they've done something. They know that having that conversation, as Matti just said, either leads to, well, why the hell did you create me? And am I unwanted? Or if you had a choice in the matter, why the hell did you do this? And it also, I mean, look, by creating somebody, the parent is also having to, I mean, part of the imposition is also like, what if it is a bad quality of life? What if the child does want to exit? That's not something that our societies allow. Those aren't easy conversations to have. Those aren't conversations that they can have in most situations. And so there's all of this. Yeah, I mean that's a huge part of the imposition, I think.
And so, Laura, you have answered your first natalist objection. Now the rest of the 17 that you have.
No, I only had one more that I think so, and I've actually made a whole video on my channel rebutting what I'm about to say, but I'm putting myself I'm really going out on a limb. I'm putting myself in someone else's shoes here. But what if someone were to say to you that you're making too big a deal out of the level of imposition that is being put on someone? Because if you look around you, this person may say that, you know, the vast majority of people seem to be fairly happy with the lifestyle because the vast majority of people have children. And if they weren't happy with the imposition on them, they wouldn't have continued it to, you know, to then make the same imposition on their children, right? So what would you say to that they think the imposition isn't actually that big a deal, and it seems to be pretty widely accepted by the people who are imposed upon?
Yes, we sort of replied to that person by writing a book in the meantime, since you last interviewed us half a year ago. We went to work and we thought about that question and found out two things. First, that people are not so happy about this imposition going on. There are many people in the history of Europe and other places. We confined our attention to Europe who have thought otherwise. And secondly, what is the second point that I'm supposed to be making here? I forgot. But anyway, so there are responses to that question.
Yeah, I mean, people do tend to have children because they had a bad time, right? I mean, that's a really big piece of what drives people to have children, often those that are thinking about it ahead of time. I mean, most of us are here because people weren't thinking at all. But yeah, I mean, it almost is like people try to cure their own imposition by imposing on somebody else. I mean, I think that's often the case. You know, my parents got it wrong, I'll get it right kind of thing. And that doesn't work. I mean, it's just true foolishness.
Yeah, it's passing on trauma from one generation to the next. Cool. So those are sort of the two main things I'm trying to put myself in the position of, you know, like a normie sort of natalist person. And those are the two main things that I can think would maybe spring to their mind. So let's move on from like the natalist objections. So one thing I wanted to ask is, what is the Pronatalist Panopticon?
Do you know what a panopticon is?
Let's say for the sake of this, I don't. So explain it.
It's okay. Jeremy Bentham, an Enlightenment English philosopher, was also an inventor, and he sort of designed this prison where in the middle there is a guard tower, and the workrooms of the prisoners are all around in a circle. And from the guard tower you can see to each cell, but from the cells you cannot see whether the guard tower is personneled or not. You don't know if anybody is looking at you. But since you are assuming that somebody is looking at you, you are sort of working on like a good little prisoner, assuming that you are being watched. And so you internalize the rules. And this is what we think that happens in the case of us thinking in the end that we want to have children.
Yeah, because by doing so, we're behaving. I think that's another way of saying it. You know, we're being good little boys and girls that are doing what mommy and daddy wants by continuing the, you know, cycle of sentience.
And if somebody doesn't like Jeremy Bentham because he was just a dry utilitarian, then Michel Foucault used Panopticon as well.
Yeah.
And the the concept of the confessional, so that people sort of live in their own sense of sin, even without the confessional, even without the priest telling them that they have sinned.
Right. So the general idea of a panopticon is that it makes someone behave in the way that they would think they're expected to behave, and the
Yes.
pronatalist
Yeah.
version of that is that they behave in the way that they, it's that, but within the context of pronatalism, basically, they act in accordance with how they think wider society expects them to behave, basically.
Yeah, that it's
Yeah.
essentially ever watchful eyes. That
Yeah.
if it catches you doing something like not having a child, that that like what you're supposed to be doing, that there's going to be consequences for that. There's going to be loneliness. There's going to be death with nobody. There's going to be no friends, or that there's all these. A lot of it really does have to do with social costs. I think all of it has to do with social costs, essentially.
We just have to realize that these are built, these are constructed, construed behavioral patterns. Now, alone in the prison cell, the prisoner wouldn't be doing the knitting or whatever they were doing. They would just have been lazy and eaten what comes in and never done anything. But they are assuming that the correct way of working and not getting a punishment is to work. They are assuming. Nobody has told them. They just think, well, when I was a criminal, I used to know non-criminal people. What did they do? Oh, they worked. Ha, horrible. I'll have to work now so that I don't get further punishment. And this is the same thing. Nobody even has to tell the next generation that they have to produce the next generation, because they are assuming that this is the case. This is the panopticon they are in. They don't know if their parents or God is watching them and wanting them to do it. They learn to want it themselves.
Yeah. And I think also psychologically want to become the one that watches. I mean, I think that's part of it too, is that, to be watched, to have eyes ever upon you, to be the victim of the panopticon essentially is a really heavy burden. And so once you've obeyed, then you get to be the one to put the pressure on somebody else. The pressure is off you, essentially. And I think psychologically that's part of what's going on in the natalist mentality. Yeah.
So, how do you and I know this might have been the case with a lot of my questions, but like this question may be the topic for a whole nother paper, but how do you differentiate the imposing a lifestyle argument from other arguments of imposition out of practical necessity? So to give an example, a lot of people say that there are certain impositions that need to be imposed on people because it's practically necessary for the world we live in. So, for example, taxes, tyranny of the majority in democracy, these are things that, at least in many societies, are seen as, these are impositions on people, but they're necessary for society to function. How would you differentiate because someone could say, obviously, like I agree with you, it's an imposition to put a lifestyle on someone, but it's necessary if we are to continue society. And so how would you differentiate your argument from imposition from those other arguments of imposition for things like taxes, etc.?
Amanda, before you go to all the variations, if you like to do it in here, then I would just say that we are working within the liberal democratic society already. In that paper, it doesn't mean that we are liberal democrats in any normal, usual sense or anything like that. We might be raving Maoist for all I know. But whatever we are, or green spaghetti monsters, or the lower green spaghetti monster. But the point is that we are addressing the liberal democratic audience in there. So we are granting that point. We are saying, yes, there are sort of impositions that are are necessary, and one such is that this is a liberal democracy, and we are not denying that. Now, one feature of a liberal democracy is that the children get an open future, the right to an open future. Are you going to give them that? Haha. That's what
Right. Okay. Yeah.
we're saying. So yes, we are granting the necessity of some impositions, but we are saying that these must be the right impositions.
Okay. Cool. Yeah. I get you.
And incidentally, if we remove the imposition of creating human beings, all of these other impositions kind of go away, right? If we stop producing human beings, then all these other things don't become a necessity to impose because there's nobody left to impose it on. But yeah, I don't really know that I have anything else to add here. I mean, unless you're sort of interested in, I'm not really sure, like hearing the different sort of versions of imposition that have existed or.
Well, yeah. Well, to be honest, if you wanted to go through a bit of the history, you could, because it was one of my questions that I was going to ask, but I actually skipped it because I thought you'd kind of briefly talked about the distinction between this argument that you've put forward and previous ones. So I skipped it. But if you do want to detail the history, then go for it, because it would be interesting to hear.
It's totally up to you. I'll do it real quick. So just briefly, imposition has been a part of the language of antinatalism from my earliest days as an antinatalist, because it was, and Mendham has said it since time immemorial. I mean, there's examples of him saying imposition in relation to procreation since 2007, 2008. I mean, and I, for a long time, thought that was the origin. I also thought risk was where. I also thought the risk argument was originated from Mendham too. But very few people back in those days had much of a knowledge base of the academic side of antinatalism. So there was very few people that could possibly even correct me on any of that back in the old days. So that's where I learned about it from. And again, until Matti and I started writing this paper, which was, I think, again, back in January of this year, I really had no concept of the fact that there was this much larger academic history, usage of the term imposition. But as it turns out, Schopenhauer said imposition. Hey, let me get the name of the paper because I always forget it. In 1999, Sienna Schifrin wrote a paper called Wrongful Life, Procreative Responsibility, and the Significance of Harm. And for those that don't know, this is most usually where people place the origin of the consent argument. And she uses the word imposition like constantly in that paper. But I wouldn't necessarily say that it was its own argument. Like I wouldn't necessarily say it was used as like an embellishment, but it was just sort of a word used to describe this, using your will onto somebody else. But it wasn't really the argument she was trying to get at.
Right. Yeah. No, I was just going to say, so it sounds like historically the word has been very much used in the discourse. Yeah. But a specific and independent argument hasn't been formulated around it.
Not really, no. I mean, I always kind of liken it to like this. It's like a flask that all of these different philosophical pessimists have kind of had a sip from. And also moderate pronatalists too, like Rivka Weinberg in her book "The Risk of a Lifetime," I think is what it's called. She uses it constantly. And in further papers that she's written about antinatalism too. So it's been a part of the language of antinatalism for a tremendously long time. And it's been used in all kinds of different ways, but not really until now has it ever been formulated into its own argument.
Yeah. Go on, Matti.
And it's important to realize that we are not talking about only the word, we are talking about a concept here. And now, although the word imposition has been used in the discussion for ages, it has in many cases meant exposition, really. It means that exposing new people to a life, you're sort of putting them on a plate and letting the wolves eat them. And that's exposition, that's not imposition. Imposition is sort of different. It is not just exposing you to danger. Exposition is opening the door. Imposition is pushing you in.
Right.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, and as we went through the literature, I mean, a big part of writing this paper was, reading tons of different papers and books on antinatalism and finding not only usage of the word imposition, but there was all these other words that people have that are so like imposition that people have been using for a long time. So in 1994, Matti, you used the word assign. So that was sort of a version of an imposition argument, although you do say imposition quite a lot in liberal utilitarianism and applied ethics. Expose, de Graza used the word expose quite a lot of times, which is sort of leading towards an imposition argument. Forced upon, again, Schifrin used impose, the biggest one, though, is Julio Cabrera. Julio Cabrera has this manipulation argument, which is similar to our version of the imposition argument, but there's some pretty key differences. But we would basically say that he was sort of the closest, maybe, of the academic set, at least, to really work the idea of an imposition, although renamed or named manipulation in his case into sort of a solid argument.
And we have later on found out that Julio Cabrera actually almost makes the argument that we are making.
Yeah.
He's not making it in the same words because he's a continental philosopher. I'm an analytical philosopher. Never mind what that means, but it means that he says things in a difficult manner, and I try to say things in a fairly easy manner, an understandable manner. That's why he hasn't been found for this. And there is the thing that he is still a little bit talking about the exposition of the non-existing people. He's saying that he can actually talk about those non-existing nothings, and that's another metaphysical twist that I don't understand in here.
Yeah.
But so we are not claiming originality. Julio Cabrera said it all.
So I want to kind of, this isn't one of the questions I wrote down, but I just kind of wanted, since it's come up, I kind of wanted to understand, because I'm not fully getting it yet, the difference between imposition and exposition. So is the difference, if we're talking about procreation, for example, exposition is creating them and bringing them into the world, exposing them to, all of the things that antinatalists have concerns with. Imposition would be controlling them once they're created. Is that the difference?
Partly, but there's also something in the genesis of the imposition and of the exposition. In the article, we used the odd example of the weird example of elective appendectomy. So when your appendix is removed for no acute medical reason. Now, why would anyone do that? I wonder. I wouldn't. But people do it in some regions of the world. They just go to the doctor and say, please remove my appendix. Well, anyway, there are many reasons for why this might be happening. Perhaps they have been sort of informed that they can do it. A friend said, Fred, you can now go to the doctors and get your appendix removed. So that's informing. Or perhaps somebody persuaded Fred, said, Fred, I'll buy you an ice cream if you go to the doctors and have your appendix removed. Of course, there are other possibilities, like somebody grabs Fred, takes him to the doctor removes the appendix. Or there is, Fred, you go there, or I'll shoot you dead. That's coercion, forcing and coercing in there. Now, people are doing it although they are not forced or coerced into it, and I don't think that they are doing it for the ice cream. I'm thinking that they are mostly doing it because they are both exposed and imposed to it. They are exposed to it by a society saying that there are elective appendectomies are available and you can get them if you want one. And then there is the social, cultural thing that is different from what I have in my country. I wouldn't dream of going to an elective appendectomy. But some people are going there, and I'm thinking that they have been culturally manipulated, indoctrinated. You use whatever word you want for it, but that's imposition. So exposition was making the elective appendectomy available. That was the exposition part. Now, somehow indoctrinating a person actually to go there, that's a cultural imposition. And that's the same thing with having children. I mean, somebody may say to you, Matti, have children. No, I won't. I'll buy you an ice cream if you have children. No, I still don't. I will take you there, or I will shoot you. Maybe if I try to protect myself. But it's more that I've been, well, there was an attempted imposition on me on that. It's available. Nobody denies me of having children, and there some people are, by the way, denied that. So that's mind blowing. But anyways, but an imposition was attempted on me. I have been living in a culture which says that I should have children. I don't, and I won't. But I've been able to avoid or fight that imposition. But so your question was, what is the difference between exposition and imposition? Exposition is when it's available, and by giving birth to a live child, you make the horrors of the world available to that child. By telling the child or letting the child understand that mommy and daddy are good people and they have had children, so you should have children too, that's an imposition. Did that confuse or clarify?
Yeah, I kind of get it now. I kind of get it. So does the imposition argument that you two have put forward, does it have any implications beyond antinatalism that you've explored, or?
Yes, of course. Like for elective appendectomies, it's a well discussed thing in medical ethics and bioethics and nursing ethics and all that. So is paternalism okay or is paternalism not okay? And so we are riding on the consensus that strong, hard paternalism, the kind that you almost cannot avoid, and which curtails your liberty and autonomy, they are not acceptable. So we are just, I am a bioethicist. We are, Amanda has cleverly utilized my my knowledge of bioethics in this argumentation.
Yeah. So, if there was like one thing you wanted readers to take away from the paper, what would you hope it'd be?
Don't have children.
Yeah, that's the crux of it, right? I mean, but I also think that the paper includes.
Let's say they're all. I was just gonna let's say they're already antinatalist. Let's say it's an antinatalist reader.
Yeah. I think part of the paper also is a communication to antinatalists about how to move forward, to all people, really. I mean, but in terms of, the last sort of part of the paper is, Matti has this great line in there of, let's focus on putting out the fires and worry about the color of the hose later. So it speaks directly to, I think, some of the problems in the movement. It's not just about making this argument itself. It's about how to, work together. And, as Lawrence, you're somebody who's been in the community for quite some time now, and you've kind of seen, all the internal wars and all of the nonsense that happens, and how, our discomforts with one another so often sort of is a louder factor than the unborn. Suddenly we're not worrying so much about preventing lives or any of these other truly antinatalist goals or ideas. We're worried about this, guy next to me smells, or I hate what he believes, and it becomes all about, not really moving the juggernaut forward. It becomes about, again, our discomforts with one another, and how that's really not an acceptable path forward. Like, we have work to do as antinatalists, and our Matti and mine's imposition argument is a new, excellent tool, I believe, in moving forward. But then there's also this sort of itis of the movement. There's sort of this disease of the movement that we have to address, of not really being focused enough, and not really having the victims as our focus, not having the unborn as our true focus, and what we need to sort of do to combat that. it's a call to combat that. I think that's how the paper ends, in my opinion. Yeah.
Also perhaps different messages to different audiences. Now,
Yeah.
if a philosopher is reading that, then check out our argument. I mean, don't pay too much attention to our critiques of the existing arguments. We are not against them. We are just saying that they are not of much practical use. Check out our new argument and say if it makes any sense. If you are hesitating or thinking that antinatalism might be a good thing, then and are not a philosopher, then go straight to the end where we give these wonderful practical instructions and tell you that even if you already have a child, don't despair, don't have another, and just stay with us. And then those who don't have a practical interest and don't have a theoretical interest, either don't read it at all, or if you read it, don't worry if you don't understand it. I don't understand much of it either.
It gives everybody in whatever circumstance a path forward, you know, in this thing. And I think that's part of the paper that I'm most proud. One of the things that I'm most proud of being in there is, I mean, it's we don't want to exclude anybody, you know, whether you're somebody who's already had children, just don't have any more, and you can still have a voice in all of this. That's the messaging at the end of the paper. I think it's really important.
Yeah. What reaction have you had so far? And like, what reaction would you be? So, no. Let's keep it with the first part of the question. What reaction have you had so far?
Well, we were number one for in views in the Cambridge Quarterly of Healthcare Ethics. So it got a really astounding number of views. Really kind of unprecedented, actually, which is pretty awesome. We haven't got a ton of responses so far. We've had, Julio Cabrera read it. I can't think of names right now. Karima Kurma read it and thought we were onto something good, which is great. Masahiro Morioka read it. That's the name I was trying to think of. Sorry. And Mendham just made 2 different response videos. No, that was to something else. Never mind. Did make a response video of sorts to it. So it's making the rounds, and I think people are taking the time to absorb it a bit. Yeah.
And my colleagues are saying, oh, Matti wrote one of those silly antinatalism papers again. Let's look other way, not to embarrass you.
No.
And what reaction would you like to have? Like, what's like putting aside, 100% praise, all of that, because everyone, whenever they put something new out, they would enjoy, everyone to come forward and be, pat them on the back. But beyond that, what sort of reaction would you like to have?
Just instant extinction, like just they read it and all of a sudden nobody has any more kids ever. No, I mean I hope people will argue it. Like I hope people will, if they agree, that's great. But I would really like to see people do more comparison, challenge our claims. I mean, do they really think that maybe they have a way of proving that the asymmetry is a better argument and that it is more important that, maybe it's not so much that it's not a good tool for antinatalist activism, but we're just using it wrong. And, I'd like to see those kinds of refutations of it. I think it's not very common yet for to really consider the activist side of antinatalist application. And so I'd like for that side of the conversation to grow from this. It's not, we've moved past antinatalism just being a philosophical position. It is also a social movement. And this is the first antinatalist argument that has been created specifically for that purpose. And what does that mean? What is the impact moving forward on how antinatalism is going to grow as a philosophical position, as a social movement? And so I think that this is,
Well, I can, if you, sorry, do you want to go, Matti?
I would like to see philosophers go back to the basics, to the basic cycle the moon around the Earth or the Earth around the Sun or whatever. The discussion has been going on in epicycles for too long. It's epicycles, so meaning that if you cannot observe that it's perfectly round, then you just assume that the moon makes a little epicycle every now and then, and so on and so forth. This is what killed the astronomical theory that we had last. There were too many epicycles in the end, so it was more convenient to think that the movement is oval. So go figure. But now I'm trying to say something, or we are trying to say something similar, that the circle was too simplistic. We cannot be talking about that, whether it be constant asymmetry risk or quality of life. We need something sort of radical. And that sort of radical is that imposition forces the cycle to be the oval that it is. And then we get rid of the epicycles, the million articles that are written to philosophical journals about X's argument, about Y's argument, about what Smith and Jones 2022 said about Benatar saying something about somebody. Now that's silly. That doesn't help anyone. It isn't philosophy. It isn't antinatalism. It isn't ethics. It's nothing. Now back to basics and look at our argument. It is an oval. An oval. We call it imposition. Now study that and tell us what went wrong.
Yeah, and if I could just add one thing, I mean, in terms, there's sort of this weird thing in antinatalist circles where we can make critiques of birth, we can make critiques of procreation, but we can't talk about life. If you're talking about life, oh, that's ephilism, or that's the child-free world. Child-free people talk about life. They talk about the ins and outs of living, and that's, in my opinion, just been a huge mistake. And so I think that this really is a challenge to where people are at in antinatalism, at the core of it, those that don't consider themselves antinatalists, in the online circles. So, yeah, I think it's going to shake things up.
Yeah. Well, in the spirit of you wanting people to, tackle the paper and stuff like that and do responses, I can give you my thoughts now. So I've got two main things that the first thing I want to say overall is that I enjoyed reading the paper. I think it was a good paper, and I think it does add something novel to our understanding of imposition. And I think that is one of the things that you were trying to achieve, right? You were trying to achieve that, and then also having an impact on how antinatalists advocate. Those seem to be the two things that you hope to achieve. One of them you either achieve or not straight away by publishing the paper. People can see whether you have added something novel. This second bit of whether it's going to impact advocacy, that's more something we have to wait to see, right? We can't see the results straight away. So
100%.
So that, like, no one's going to know until we do know. So my two, so those were my overarching sort of positive things about. I think out of the two goals that you seem to have set out to achieve, you've achieved the one that we can already tell. The other one we don't know about yet. My other two thoughts were one is, so my two, they're not really pushbacks, but they're more observations. I've got one for each of your goals. So the first one is that whilst I think that your novel contribution is highlighting the specific imposition of a lifestyle, which my understanding and my exposure to arguments from imposition before, and I've even written my own articulation of it before on the Antinatalist Handbook website. At no point did I mention lifestyle. I'd never really heard anyone talk about imposing a lifestyle before. So I think that is a valid contribution and a valuable contribution as well. But I think that if the argument from imposition is going to focus on that, I think it leaves out other perhaps even more important impositions, which I labeled before, like the biological ones and stuff like that. So because when I have ever talked about imposition with people before, it's not been about lifestyle, not mainly just because it hasn't really occurred to me before. It's always been about the biological things of like you're imposing, well, this is not biological, but the need for meaning, but also you're imposing the fact that you've got to maintain a body. That body is going to be able to get sick, and you're imposing the recovery process on them. You're imposing all these things about, you've got to work to eat and drink, and seeking shelter, all this sort of stuff. And that's where I've really put the emphasis of the imposition argument when I've ever made it before. So I thought maybe the paper was unnecessarily narrowing our understanding of imposition, or someone could equally interpret it as it's simply adding another part to the imposition argument. What do you guys think about that?
It's a very good point to make, and we'd say that everybody is welcome to extend and widen the horizons. Now, for the actual word lifestyle in there. Now, this is the paper, the history of the title of the paper. First of all, Amanda showed me Rivka Weinberg's the risk of what it is,
a lifetime.
Risk of a lifetime.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So then I sort of thought, the risk of a lifestyle, that would be something. And we were, for a very long time, we were working under that title, the risk of a lifestyle. And then at some point, when it went all the way to imposition, and we learned something about Julio Cabrera and all that, then it became the imposition of a lifestyle, and that was the article's name when we submitted it. Now, imposing a lifestyle, a new argument for antinatalism, that's editorial. That's the editor saying that it's sexier this way, that you are mentioning antinatalism and using a more active word in the beginning, and so on and so forth. So this means just for your question, that lifestyle is an afterthought, and if you go back to the paper from page 1, it's mentality. It still begs your question, but it was an imposition of a mentality. It's what is it, Amanda? Post-natal mental imposition.
Post-natal mental position. Yeah.
That's how we say it. Now, biological, we think, has been with us, with Kari Makerma and Amanda. You know all these people who have done the biological imposition before.
Yeah, definitely Julio Cabrera. It's the biological impositions are a big way that Mendham uses it. I mean, he's used it in a number of. I personally, my understanding of imposition, even with this our version of it now, has always included these other sort of. It's all imposed. Other ways that it's been used. Mendham sort of uses it as part of like some of his economic arguments that, especially in relation to like quantitative easing, by creating debt, we put, pressures on the future, or what's another way, or, I don't know what the origins of this particular argument are, but like if you're born in a Western country, you essentially have all of this slave labor that like, upholds your life, and that's an imposition on them. It's an imposition on you, and that's not the argument that we're making in the paper. But like, those are all part of the imposition of creating a life. It's all part of the imposition of birth, and those are all relevant. But I think what we were trying to do was specifically get to this imposition of not only being created and having to live a life, but this pressure, this panopticon, these ever watchful eyes of then having to go and be a procreator oneself, and that's sort of the focus that we were trying for. Sorry, go ahead, Matti.
And I'm still interested and would like to emphasize the exposition-imposition difference here, because yes, when we are brought into this world, we are exposed to biological dangers and death and all these things. But then you have both heard the argument, why don't you just kill yourself? And of course, that's the solution to the exposition problem. there. But the imposition remains, and Karim Ackerman and Julio Cabrera have said this before us, that now we are bumping into a different problem, that the same parents who created us, they also told us that we are not allowed to kill ourselves. So on top of the exposition that we are exposed to all that bad in life, we are also imposed uh, to believe that the only solution to that, offing ourselves, exiting, is forbidden. So that's why I'm saying just that the exposition and imposition, they work together in this way.
Yeah. So I think like well, so my other thing for the other goal that I think you were sort of or are hoping to achieve with the paper, with in terms of changing advocacy. My other thing, it's not a critique. It's more just I see it slightly differently. In that, I do think the established sort of argument, like the ones with the consent, risk, asymmetry. I'm not as pessimistic about how easy they are to communicate to people, because I think there are very simple analogies or thought experiments you can use with the average person to be able to communicate what you mean with them. I've tried to do that on the Antinatalist Handbook website, on the Why Antinatalism section. And for example, I'm part of a debate club in London. It's a vegan debate club. It's not very big. There's maybe sort of like 10, 15 active members in it, but we meet up semi-regularly, and there are two of us in the group that are fully signed up antinatalists. There are a range of people who have sympathetic views and other people who, for example, the other day we had another guy join. He just never heard of the concept before, and he became quickly relatively convinced by it. So there are people sympathetic, but there are also many people who don't agree with antinatalism, but in that sort of in that context, and I will concede to you that most of the people in this group are very philosophically minded. So maybe I'm making a point against myself here, but myself and the other guy, we have expressed the whole range of arguments these people before, and they've had no issue sort of grappling with them when we've used certain analogies or thought experiments. But I will concede that they are all very philosophically minded. So maybe what I will do is I hope to do more sort of street interviews with people. So what I'll do is I'll just try out a range of things and see what lands. So let's put pending on that point I just made. That point is pending.
Well, I still think you bring up, I mean, it's still a good point, though. I mean, look, all antinatalist activism is pretty young, as all three of us know, right? Like, how, it's pretty recent that people are getting out on the streets and using any of these arguments, and testing their effectiveness. And as I said at the beginning of this interview, like, some people are immediately convinced by consent. If you don't have, if you can't get consent, then you don't have permission to act. I mean, that's just simply communicated to some people, and they just don't have kids after that. That's all they need. But I don't know. In almost 14 years of talking to people online, talking to people, like when I was in grad school, I talked to hundreds of people and used all of these arguments all the time. I just have personally a lot of evidence of where people get stuck, and they get stuck in the counterfactual thing, the fact that we're talking about beings who don't exist. And that gives them, I've just witnessed so many instances of the ways that people are able to wiggle out of not having to deal with this whatsoever. Like if they sense we're talking about beings that don't exist and how this is too abstract, then all of a sudden they can just dismiss the whole thing, and it's a non-issue. But I think if we're talking about something that is very real, very concrete, when you create somebody, you're manipulating them in such a way that that they have this pressure on them to then become procreators. And other elements as well, the search for meaning, the impossible, the difficulty of exiting. I mean, these are things I think that people can more readily understand. And I don't, I think there's things that they can get stuck on there too. But I do think that it's a cleaner tool than a lot of these other ones have proven to be for a lay population. Again, I think the example that you brought, your group, it's like, if people are more philosophically minded, I think you're going to have more luck. But what about Joe, nobody on the street? What's going to work on them? Sorry, Matti, go ahead.
Remind me if I forget one of these. Again, two things, different to different, and then what was the other one? Real time. Now, what I mean by those is that, first of all, Lawrence, I salute you and antinatalist advocacy, and all the best for that one. And you will not mind that you are now our research subject, because we are studying you and seeing whether you succeeded or not. What you are saying about things is exactly what I'm thinking too. And Amanda was saying there are different things for different people. No use talking usual non-philosophical stuff to philosophers or vice versa. Just to each their own. And then in real time. Now again, another story about the history of this particular article imposing a lifestyle. Amanda and I were writing it and preparing it at the same time when we were corresponding with a journalist from a New York magazine. And now that was a person who was sort of interested in antinatalism, but was not convinced, but tried first to find an argument for antinatalism, and then when we provided proper argument for that, then tried to wriggle out of it and have children of their own. And now that is all over the paper now. So we are not, nobody is inventing the philosopher's stone. We are not sitting in an ivory tower. We are not making this up like so many people are. We are there. We are already in the trenches, and we are looking at your periscope and their periscope and seeing what kind of people you see from your periscope and what we see from ours. And then, is it worth going over, or will we just be shut down by machine gun fire if we do? All that's part and parcel of our philosophy, is our advocacy. Our advocacy is our philosophy. But so my point were different messages to different people and real time. So it's happening now. It's happening in this particular moment in time when we have historically when we have contraception and we have liberal attitudes and all that may change. Give or take a couple of decades, and we live a Mad Max world, and there's no contraceptives and no liberal democracy anymore. Then our chances are gone.
So, thank you both for coming on and talking about the paper. Is there anything that people can expect from you both, either as a pair or independently in the future, like related to this article at all? I think, I don't know if I misheard, but I think you mentioned something earlier that you're working on.
Yes, absolutely. It's we are always continuing work on all these topics, and we are not entirely pleased about the imposition argument in the paper. It is worth a read, and it's worth developing. But we have already been developing that for 5-6 months now, and we may yet show the audience something really special about it.
Okay. And so is that all you can say at the moment, or?
Yes, the wonderful thing that we've been working on is under review somewhere, so we cannot summon all the
divulge anymore. Yeah.
We have a lot in the pipeline, so there's we've never stopped, and we won't stop, and so lots on the way.
Okay, cool, nice. Well, if you just both let me know where people can stay up to date with any, announcements you'll be making. I will put them in the description below. But thanks so much for both coming on and talking about the paper and replying to my "in the shoes of a natalist" responses. And yeah, it's been great talking to you both. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you
Always a
very much,
pleasure, Lawrence.
It's fantastic, and your natalist camouflage was almost perfect.
Is that Lawrence? Whoa, who is that? Yeah, no, thank you as always, Lawrence. It's always a pleasure to come on. Thanks for having us both. This has been a lot of fun.